You just finished watching a TED Ed video on the Atlantic slave trade that talks about some of the same ideas that were mentioned in class today while doing the timeline activity. And as a recap, you saw the mention again of the African kingdoms and African societies that arose and grew strong because they were the ones that were going in and capturing other people that they would then sell to the Europeans in the slave trade. And that was mentioned again in the video. And then you saw the impact that that has had on Africa after the slave trade ended. And you saw that as there were more guns that were brought into the continent, those kingdoms began relying on those guns, and those civil wars continued. So that was one of the impacts of the slave trade on the continent of Africa. And then another one that they mentioned briefly in the video that we didn't talk about yet in class is the idea that the ending of the slave trade led way to the beginning of colonization. And colonization is a time period in history where European powers sent leaders around the world and began colonizing other lands, and it became part of their empire. And what would happen is they would send members of government to set up governments in these regions so that they could come to control that territory, and they could control the resources, and they could control the people. You may have learned that the United States was previously a colony of the United Kingdom, and our war for independence separated us from the United Kingdom and gave us our independence. And just like we were a colony of the British, many African countries were colonies of the British as well. And then many other countries in Africa were colonies of other European countries. And this was all paved by the fact that the slave trade ended, but Europeans wanted the ability to continue to extract resources from Africa. So even though the slave trade ended, they still wanted the goods that they were getting there aside from the people. And as we mentioned in class, the Europeans had previously not wanted to go inland in Africa because they were afraid of what they were going to find there. And now there were two inventions that helped so that the Europeans were no longer afraid of going into the continent. And one of those inventions was something called quinine. And quinine was a medicine essentially that would reduce the impacts of malaria. So it didn't protect them from malaria completely, but it would reduce any side effects that they got from getting the disease, and that disease was carried by mosquitoes, and it's still present today. So if you go to Africa today, you have to take malaria pills that reduce the impact of malaria. And the other invention that made them less afraid of going inland was the invention of the steamship, and they could then use those steamships to navigate the rivers so that they didn't have to depend on just using land travel to get into Africa. So the ending of the slave trade paved the way for these African colonies to be set up by the British, but somehow it had to be decided what was going to set up these colonies. And in order to teach you that, in order for you to get a look at how colonization impacted certain countries, we're going to be doing a project. So the project has been shared with you in Google Classroom. It's called African Colonization Research Project. I don't want to read you everything because I've just told you a little bit about what you're going to be doing, but to give you a little more background about what I just mentioned, they set up these colonies at an event called the Berlin Conference. And the Berlin Conference was this period in time where a bunch of European people got together and they decided who should have what piece of Africa. Interestingly enough, there were no Africans present to have a say in what would happen to them. So everyone's going to be doing a little bit of research on the Berlin Conference so that you understand what happened there and how your country became a colony. And from there, you're then going to do some research about your country as a colony, and then how your country gained independence and what impact colonization had on that country. So you're going to do research in the library over the course of 2 days with Mr. Schumacher, who has set up a LibGuide for us. And you're going to be creating a newspaper or a newsletter, and you are going to share your research in the form of a Pages newsletter. It says your teachers would recommend that you use a Pages template. If you have another place where you like creating newsletters or you feel comfortable, you're welcome to bring the idea to us and we can look at it and approve it. The list of requirements is on this document that has been shared with you, and I'm not going to read through it yet because where we are at this point is we need to actually do the research before we start creating anything. So yes, you're going to be creating a newspaper article or a newspaper. Yes, you're going to be expected to have images that have captions and a map and a flag, but you're going to get to that point after you do some baseline research. So here is the rubric. The project is going to be 50 points. You're going to be working in partners of our choosing, and we'll get more to that in a second. So after some baseline research in the library, we'll go into more details about what you're going to be creating. But what you should be starting with is these research questions. And these research questions are going to guide you down the path to complete all of the tasks that are assigned to you for your final project. So you're all going to fill out what happened at the Berlin conference, and then you're going to be assigned to the country, and questions 2 through 10 will all relate to the country that you're assigned. So what European country came to control the region that is your assigned country? For example, if you picked Algeria, what European country colonized Algeria? How did your country resist European colonization? Or did they try to resist, or were they very accepting of European colonization? That's what you're going to look for. How was the government of your country set up by the European government? There is a terminology here that you need to understand, and that's the idea of a direct government or an indirect government. And the direct government was where the European leaders sent members from their own country, and the entire government was governed by those European leaders. So for example, in the country of Ghana, which was a British colony, the government was a direct government. It was all led by British leaders. Whereas in some of the French colonies, they used an indirect style of government where the Europeans would come, they would train Africans to be the leaders so that the previous African leaders became the leaders in the European colony. So that's an indirect government where it was just through people that were already there that they continue that government, but with the influence of the British. What was colonial life like in your country? How long was your country a colony? How did your country begin fighting for independence? Or did they fight? Or was it an easy transition from colonization to independence? Who were the main leaders of the independence movement in your country? What changed in your country in the period following independence in the sense of, did life improve? Did it not improve? Did it lead to wars? Was there an easy transition of government power? And what impact did colonization have on your country? So tell me if it led to a change in major resources. Was there a challenge in setting up an African-style government? These are the kinds of things you should be thinking about. The countries that you have to choose from are these listed: Ghana, Algeria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Africa, Sudan, Nigeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mali, Libya, or Chad. My recommendation is that you do a little bit of background research about each of these countries, because in the Google form that follows, you're going to need to rank order 1 through 3 of the countries that you are interested in studying, and then I will be pairing you based on your rankings. So go ahead, go to Google Classroom, fill out the form. It has some reflection questions from the previous video, and then it asks you to rank your countries. Thank you.